I thought I would just actually make some comments about how it is that what circumstance we find ourselves in terms of how the current business circumstances are and why innovation is so critical. Separately from the economic crisis, if you actually look at what's happening in kind of the world of work, you have the thesis that the world is flat. So you have increasing global competition. You have decreasing time frames by which to deliver products and services, in addition to the increasing competition. And then you have a need for, how do you, in fact, with limited information and limited time, make those decisions? And that's a circumstance that not just businesses are in, but actually all layers in terms of how you look at the business. So it's the companies themselves, but it's also the individuals in the businesses and the managers of the businesses. Because one of the parts of what I think is changing in the world is that every individual is now a small business. And the same ways that you think about business competitiveness, you think of individual competitiveness. You think of the characteristics of how do I, as an individual professional, stay competitive, right, in a globally competitive world? How do I innovate in the practices that I do in order to be a successful professional? And I think that part of the thing that's interesting when you look at how do you create kind of entrepreneurial organizations or innovation is you actually have to go all the way from individual contributors to managers to companies and how those bind together. So let's start with a little bit with the individuals. So why are individuals essentially small businesses now? Well, individuals are small businesses because the old way that careers used to run, get a job at IBM, big law firm, whatever, work there for 30 or 40 years, that's gone. And it's gone everywhere. It's not just gone in the US, in Western world, it's gone in Japan. The average person who is 30 in Japan has had 4 jobs, right? So the salaryman culture has gone away. You have an increasing trend of what is called the free agent nation, which is many more individual contractors or consultants actually, doing their business. And the skill sets in terms of what it is that you need to do are now much more developed by the individual than by companies because, before, in the old regime with IBM, et cetera, there was like corporate training programs and those sorts of things, and those aren't completely gone away, but in a market where people are changing jobs every 2 to 4 years, the incentives for corporations to actually provide extensive training regimes to their professionals, their employees, is a lot less. Now, when you move from individual contributors to managers, it even exacerbates this because not only do you have an issue where the individuals trying to keep their, what's the benchmark for their performance, what are the tools and practices they should do. Now managers have to make that decision for the company. And they have to make a decision not just like how well are their employees doing, but they have to make a decision about how well is the firm doing and how are they assembling the resources and are they staying competitive and what's going on in this very fast-moving competitive environment in order to adapt. And companies that are responding to disruptive pressures are only at the forefront of that. Right now, one of the best definitions of disruption I've heard is you take $10 out of revenue out of the system and you replace it with $1. And that's ultimately good for the ecosystem because then many more businesses can be put on top of that much more cheap cost structure. But it means that a lot of businesses need to adjust to it, and that's part of the challenge and the problem. And then when you get to the companies, going from individual to managers to companies, when you get to the companies, the challenge for them is, okay, we have these resources, we have these assets, how do we adapt given that we have essentially limited time frames and global competition? So given that we're talking about innovation, there's an interesting side focus to this problem, which was, and I use this as a lens to understand, I think, some of the forces at play here, which is, as far as in the US, as far as anyone, as far as venture capital was invented in the US, it was invented in Boston. And yet, in the last 20 years, Silicon Valley has so far stripped past Boston in terms of being a capital of entrepreneurship and innovation that basically the folks in Silicon Valley can barely remember that there is a Route 128, right? There were companies like Honeywell and so forth, and that the venture capital industry actually started in Boston. And the question, I think there's a very interesting question, which is a sidelight on this kind of entrepreneurship and innovation and what works and what doesn't work, which is, why did that happen? And a professor at Berkeley, Annalise Saxenian, wrote a really interesting book that I recommend to all of your attention called Regional Advantage. And basically, what the question that she was addressing is, okay, so we had all the attributes that you would expect to have in when people talk about Silicon Valley and what are all the ingredients in order to create this. You have a technical university, you have finance, you have existing large technology companies, you have a cadre of folks trained both in technical and in managerial roles, all the things that are normally talked about as what makes Silicon Valley interesting, and all the things that people talk about when they say, well, let's see if we replicate Silicon Valley somewhere else. And yet, all of that existed in Boston before Silicon Valley. Venture capital was invented there. Why was it, right? And what has made Silicon Valley kind of this enormous, kind of a force in terms of technical innovation, entrepreneurial success, and creating massive companies? And the basic thing, the thesis that Saxenian put forward was, it's actually the use of what I call open networks. And the reason is because the model in Route 128 was, well, we build an R&D building, right? We try to employ people there for 30 or 40 years. We discourage them heavily from talking to other people outside of the R&D building. And we try to impose, kind of non-competes to make sure that they never actually leave once they're there. Whereas the way that Silicon Valley runs is, not only do you have a kind of an encouragement that, look, companies are spun off and executives from one company are talking to another and there's a constant recombination. But the expectation is that, for example, an employee from Yahoo will be sitting down with an employee from eBay and talking about how to do the small business better. Because it'll be like, look, there'll be some areas where we're competing, but the two of us are also competing against everybody else, right, in this whole global ecosystem. So the fact that we could figure out how to move faster and how to trade, at very least, tool and process and market insights in order to do our business better makes the whole ecosystem much more competitive. Hence, Silicon Valley became a much stronger force than Boston in terms of the last cycle of the last 10 to 20 years in terms of all the consumer and internet companies. I mean, it's not an accident that Yahoo, eBay, and Google, their headquarters are all within 25 miles of each other. So, so the question is, when you kind of look at this and you say, what are the elements that made Silicon Valley successful? And are these things that we can replicate in terms of how individuals do their careers, how managers do their careers, how companies operate? I think the answer is yes. And it's basically deploying these kinds of open networks in order to have in order to get intelligence the right way. So the plan that one should have as a company or as an individual or managing a set of individuals is, how do we deploy the right set of resources effectively? It's kind of, the way I think about it is inbound and outbound, people and information. So every day you get up, you say, what is the things I need to know in order to compete, right? And what are the things reaching out to me, because there's millions of people in the ecosystem. Some of those are interesting opportunities for me as an individual, for me as a business. How do I respond to those? Well, part of actually having a network is a filter for both people and information. And then when I'm identifying my challenges and problems, how do I go out, how do I identify the right things? How do I reach out and get them? And again, a network is a very useful thing for that. So the pattern that I think that Silicon Valley has done different than, like for example, technical universities are very good and technical skills and experienced managers are all very good. But it's a pattern of everyone using their networks in order to successfully compete as individuals, as managers, and as small companies. And there's kind of a set of principles that affect, like, why is it this works? So for example, when I'm a startup, or I'm an individual with a startup or an individual with a plan in a company, I don't publish it on a blog to the entire world, right? Because that would reveal competitive intelligence that would be bad. But like, for example, one of the pieces of advice that I give aspiring entrepreneurs who are like, well, I have my secret idea and I don't want anyone else to know it. It's like, well, identify the right people to talk to. And because you're in motion and you're going out and building this thing and you're moving, it's very unlikely you will generate competition. You are much more likely to get useful feedback in terms of being on target. Because For example, one expression that's frequently used in Silicon Valley is fail fast. Well, it's not that you celebrate failure. That's actually kind of foolish. But what you do is you actually try to figure out if you're on the right path day by day very, very quickly. One of the ways that you use your network to do that is you essentially go to people that you think are very smart, who have some insight, and talk to them, right? You've identified them through your network. You've gotten them to respond to you through your network. And you say, here's my plan. What do you think? I'll give you a personal example with LinkedIn. When I started LinkedIn, 2/3 of my network thought I was crazy. Right? And the reason I thought I was crazy was a very logical thing. They said, okay, well, the first person into LinkedIn, valueless. Second person into LinkedIn, valueless. Right? It's actually about until you get to 500,000 or 1 million people that it begins to be a useful network by which you can find information or experts and those sorts of things in order to get your task done. So, given that that's the way it works, it'll never work. Right? Now, what I knew was that by techniques of how you grow internet stuff and people being curious about it and playing with it initially, I could actually get to that size. And so I knew something that they didn't or the market didn't in order to proceed against it. But however, the honing effect of getting that kind of attention to what would be my big challenges is the only thing that we focused on from May 5th of 2003 when we launched, which was 13 employees sending out 112 invitations, right, to the end of 2004 was growth, was getting enough people into the network, because this was the key initial problem by which we would die or not. And we had honed a lot of intelligence about what the problems would be, what techniques we'd use, by going out and talking to smart people about who knew what to do in order to make that work. So, the question is, when you think about how to use your networks, that's an instance of how I use my network as an individual entrepreneur. But I think the same thing is true as individual employees. Same thing is true of managers. And when you say, okay, how is a company going to be adaptive to creating entrepreneurial innovation, it's how do they deploy all the networks of their employees and their managers together in order to be effective. Because part of the fail fast part of it is understand what could cause you to hit a problem where it wouldn't work as early as you can and readjust. It's a critical thing for succeeding in innovation, because if you don't do that, right, you tend to put in a year and then nothing works and then it all dies. So a few last components in terms of kind of how innovation and this stuff works. Most people think about innovation as products and services, right? It's a new LinkedIn, it's a new iPhone, it's a new thing, right? Innovation happens at all layers of stacks in the companies, right? There's innovation that happens in terms of recruiting. There's innovation that happens in terms of financing. There's innovation that happens in terms of company organization, how you do manufacturing or supply chain. And I will give you an example of something that I actually hadn't really thought of. Now, people normally think of LinkedIn for recruiting, but they normally think of LinkedIn for recruiting as a kind of passive candidates thing. And that's fine. That's a good use of it. It's not, obviously, hedge funds look for experts and all other kinds of things. But the interesting process that I got in terms of my own personal innovation in terms of how the company ran, as I realized that now that I can use LinkedIn, that I can do reference checking, and off-balance reference checking is the best word to do, so easily. And I was looking at how inefficient the whole recruiting process was. You post a listing, and then people apply, and then you sort it out, and people are interviewing all kinds of people. You get down to the last 2 or 3 people, right? And then when you start doing reference checking, then you're actually pretty much hoping that you're not going to find red flags, because if you do, you have to reset this very expensive process. Well, one of the things that I realized in terms of when I was looking at LinkedIn, I said, well, actually, one of the things I can do is light reference checks even before I start interviewing a candidate. Before each candidate takes 20 to 40 person hours in order to run them through, I can do a very quick light reference check and know to have an edited set at the very beginning. That compresses time frame, makes time more efficient, and is something that can lead to essentially a competitive advantage.